The war for the Cheraut system required 3 legions, 3 Primarchs. Rogal Dorn of the Imperial Fists, Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, and Konrad Curze of the Night Lords, all 3 in the same compliance theater simultaneously, which was unusual for a crusade running 4,287 primary expedition fleets at its peak. Cheraut had resisted long and bitterly enough to earn that concentration. When the fighting concluded, Curze's methods had brought his relationship with Rogal Dorn to what the official Forge World Record describes as a razor's edge of bitterness. A confrontation escalated into something the record struggled to categorize. Dorn was left grievously injured. The warriors who witnessed it were sworn to silence. The Imperium, which had just watched one of its Primarchs put another in the Medicae ward, placed Curze under guard and began drafting a formal sanction. Then it decided not to issue one. Curze used the confinement productively. He used it to write something on the wall. It's neither the great deeds we perform in battle, nor the wise words we utter in peace that shape us, but rather the hidden things we choose to undertake in the dark while none can see that define us. That sentence is in Forge World's official Night Lords publication, primary source, attributed to Konrad Curze, carved into the walls of his prison on Cheraut. A Primarch, imprisoned for conducting operations his superiors found unacceptable, carved a statement about the institutional weight of hidden choices into the stone of his confinement. He didn't hide it. He carved it, permanent, in the one place no archive could be instructed to seal, the physical wall of a cell where every subsequent Imperial officer who occupied it would read what he had written and be forced to consider it. The Imperium's official position on Konrad Curze, maintained across multiple Codex editions and Index Astartes entries, is that he was its worst disciplined Primarch, a gene-line catastrophe, a psychological failure, the most embarrassing figure of the Crusade era, tolerated throughout it, and severed from the Imperial order of battle when the heresy provided sufficient institutional cover for the separation. The post-heresy High Lords required a clean moral accounting. Good Primarchs, bad Primarchs. The Crusade's success explained by the former's virtues, the heresy explained by the latter's deviations. The Forge World Night Lords document, produced under Games Workshop's direct oversight, says something more structurally honest. Among the competing characterizations it offers for the 8th Legion and their Primarch, one sits distinct from the others. Some argued that they were simply a function of necessity. The monsters needed to drag a barbaric age into the light. A function. Not a malfunction. A function of necessity. The distinction is the argument. All of it. Here is the evidence. The Great Crusade, at operational peak, was generating compliance at a scale with no useful comparison point. 4,287 primary expedition fleets, 60,000 secondary deployment groups. The raw mechanics of conquest consumed most of the administrative capacity available. Monitoring what the Crusade had already taken, verifying that compliance documentation reflected institutional reality rather than locally convenient fiction, that the officers administering newly acquired systems were doing so within the boundaries the imperial truth claimed to mandate, was a different problem entirely. In the first 2 centuries of the 31st millennium, the Crusade possessed no dedicated mechanism for it. The Adeptus Custodes were the Emperor's personal guard. The Lexicanum confirms their Great Crusade function. They accompanied the Emperor for his protection and traveled individually as envoys. They weren't an enforcement corps. They were a close protection force for a single, specific individual. An Imperial Army Lord Commander operating 3 theater rotations distant from the Emperor's fleet was operating in a region where custodian oversight didn't reach, because custodian oversight wasn't architected to extend that far. The 10,000 existed to protect the Emperor. Auditing his officers' administrative conduct in distant compliance theaters was simply outside the operational envelope they had been built for. The Sisters of Silence were an anti-psyker force. Every canonical description of their mandate converges on the same scope: hunting rogue psychers, overseeing the tithe of psychers from Imperial worlds, protecting the Imperium from warp contamination through psychic vectors. The Forge World materials embed them organizationally within the psychic regulatory apparatus of the Crusade. You don't deploy the Silent Sisterhood against an Imperial Army officer engaged in census falsification and population exploitation. That officer isn't a psyker. Their mandate was exclusive and precisely scoped, and it didn't include the institutional corruption problem the Crusade was generating across 60,000 deployment groups. The Astartes legions proper were committed forward against external enemies. The Crusade's operational logic required their offensive momentum to remain focused outward. Using line legions to police Imperial Army formations would have generated jurisdictional chaos between brother legions, pulled offensive capacity from the Crusade's expansion at precisely the moment the Emperor needed it committed forward, and established a precedent for Astartes' intervention in Imperial administration that no Crusade-era structure could have sustained coherently. The Inquisition, designed specifically to address the enforcement gap that the Crusade's expansion phase generated, wouldn't exist in formalized structure until after the heresy had already destroyed the institutional context that made the gap critical. It was a post-crisis response. It wasn't present during the crisis. What was available, when the Crusade needed to address the crimes it couldn't officially acknowledge existing, was what the Forge World Night Lords document identifies as the 8th Legion's original deployment function. The document names specific examples. The Saragorn Enclave, conducting gene atrocities in secret while mouthing Imperial loyalty. The Court of Antaeus and its psi breeding programs. The March of 10 Million. The Crusade's interior was generating precisely the class of crime the Imperial truth most urgently needed to suppress. Crimes committed not by alien enemies but by nominal Imperial subjects, concealed beneath compliance documentation, protected by the institutional distance that made detection impossible through normal channels. For those crimes, the Forge World text is explicit. The Emperor sent the 8th Legion, specifically, as the appropriate instrument, when what was needed wasn't crushing but retribution against those who harbored treachery within the Imperium's interior. The 8th Legion's origins weren't incidental to its function. Forge World documents that the Legion's first recruits came from the prison sinks of ancient Terra, vast subterranean caverns beneath the hive infrastructure, lightless, operating without law, populated by those condemned to live permanently beyond any legal structure, and by the children born to survive among them. Pale, silent, moving without sound through permanent darkness. The official Forge World description notes something precise. The 8th Legion's gene seed had been well paired with the human stock of its first recruits. If anything, it seemed as if one had been made with the other in mind. One had been made with the other in mind. That is a design specification, not an accident of recruitment logistics. Curze himself was constructed around the judicial function at the genetic level. Index Astartes materials confirm he carried pre-built knowledge of Imperial law and the concept of justice, installed before birth, present from the moment of consciousness on Nostromo. His formal title during the Great Crusade was the last judge. Not the night haunter, which was what Nostromo called him before the Emperor arrived. Not Dark King, which was what his enemies named him. The official Crusade-era honorific used in the historical record was the Last Judge. That isn't the title given to a Primarch who malfunctioned. It's the job title of a Primarch built for a specific institutional role. The Nostromo record is the most complete evidence of what Curze's function produced under controlled conditions, because it's the only case where the installation and removal of the instrument can both be fully documented. Nostromo, as the Forge world describes it, a world of sprawling hive cities under perpetual darkness, adamantium mines worked by billions in abject poverty, wealth hoarded by a noble class indistinguishable from the criminal syndicates that enforce their authority, murder as the operational currency of daily life. Overpopulation kept in check more by suicide than by any other mechanism. A population adapted over generations to predation as the foundational social logic. Curze arrived as a child. He raised himself in Nostromo Quintus's underhives, ate the dead to survive, absorbed the memories of criminals through the biological mechanisms of a Primarch's digestive system. He spent years watching what the population was. Then he began changing it. Within the year of beginning his campaign in Nostromo Quintus, the crime rate had reached near zero. Within the decade, the Forge world confirms no crime, no sin had been committed. The planet's adamantium exports tripled. Nostromo Quintus became illuminated. The hive that had been defined by darkness and violence became, in the Forge world's description, a model of productivity. Matchless productivity, natural conformity, and total obedience. Then the Emperor arrived, took Curze for the Crusade, and departed. In a few decades, the secondary record confirms, Nostromo reverted entirely to the criminal structure that had defined it before Curze's arrival. The order he had built through years of systematic demonstration dissolved within a generation, once the credible operational presence of the consequence that produced it was gone. That isn't a character flaw. It's a capability profile. Documented evidence about the functional dependency of deterrence-based compliance on the continuous, credible presence of the deterrent. The Crusade's institutional problem was scaling that presence across 60,000 deployment groups operating simultaneously. The Night Lord's presence in a compliance theater changed the behavior of everyone operating alongside them. The specific methodology, public display of executed officials and criminals arranged in postures of formal disgrace, signed with the 8th Legion's identification in ways that made attribution certain and legible to every subsequent Imperial officer who passed through, was institutional communication rather than sadism. A compliance officer arriving in a region where the Night Lords had recently operated didn't require a direct conversation with Konrad Curze to understand the operating parameters. He could read them from the walls. The Forge world confirms the directional effect of Curze's presence on compliance stability with unusual clarity. With the Night Haunter's absence during the final years of the Great Crusade, this threat would come to the fore, with many of the worlds of that far sector overthrowing the tyrannical regimes forced upon them by the Night Lords and reverting to the anarchic ways of their past. Presence produces compliance. Absence produces regression. The Forge world text establishes the direction of that effect. The magnitude, the measurable statistical scale of compliance corruption decline in adjacent theaters during active Night Lords deployment, is analytical inference from that directional evidence, not a published Imperial audit. But the direction is in the primary source, and the direction is the argument. It's better by far to be an object of fear than of respect, For one is a true man's feeling, and the other isn't. That line, attributed to Curze in the Codex Hydra, the post-heresy record treats as a confession of sadism. Read it as an institutional claim instead. Respect can be manufactured through proximity to power, performed through ritual, inherited through social position. It collapses when those props are removed. Fear of a credible and consistently demonstrated consequence does not collapse the same way.
It encodes itself in institutional memory, in the behavior of officers who witnessed the consequence, or received the accounts of those who did, and persists in that memory long after the instrument that produced it has moved on. This is the instrumental logic of deterrence. Curze understood it before he had language to describe it, operating as a child in Nostramo Quintus, making the calculation that visible suffering of the guilty was a more durable compliance mechanism than invisible punishment. What follows is the most counterintuitive element of the operational argument, and the most important to state precisely. Curze's psychological damage wasn't a malfunction in the compliance instrument. It was a functional component of its institutional effect, a feature, not a defect. A Primarch who could conduct compliance error correction without visible psychological cost would have produced a different outcome. The methodology would have normalized.
Officers adjacent to the 8th Legion would have observed that the terror approach generated results, observed that its operator suffered no apparent penalty, and rationalized adoption. Variations of the practice would have spread across the Crusade's command culture. The Imperium would have drifted toward treating public execution as a standard administrative procedure, rather than as the signature of one clearly abnormal instrument that rational commanders understood they didn't want to emulate. Curze's suffering kept that from happening. The precognitive visions began on Nostramo. They never stopped. The documented instability, the deteriorating psychology that every primary source on Curze narrates as progressive and irreversible, the visible costs of his function, these ensured that no one looked at Konrad Curze and concluded they wanted what he had. They saw an instrument visibly destroyed by its own purpose, and drew the only rational conclusion available. This methodology required this specific kind of person, and they weren't that person, and therefore they wouldn't use it. The practice stayed contained to the 8th Legion, which was exactly where the institutional design required it to stay. The Forge World text captures what happened when this calibration failed during the heresy, after Curze's psychological deterioration had progressed beyond the threshold that maintained the original instrument's precision. That which had begun on Terra as a force that shaped cruelty into a tool had become in some cases little more than an undisciplined mob that saw cruelty as the goal and not the means. The original instrument was precise. Cruelty was a means, not a goal. When the operator's psychology collapsed into nihilism, into the precognitive certainty of futility that the Forge World describes as Curze's dominant condition by the time of the Thramas Crusade, the calibration failed. The failure mode is diagnostic. The specific kind of psychological collapse that produced this specific kind of operational failure tells us what the original psychology had been calibrated to prevent. Guy Haley's Konrad Curze, The Night Haunter, published by Black Library in May 2019, does not resolve this ambiguity. The official blurb frames it as the story of how he became a monster and a weapon of terror. Monster precedes weapon. That sequence is deliberate, and multiple sources confirm that the novel itself refuses to settle whether Curze was doing what was necessary or was simply broken. Both readings fit the evidence. That ambiguity is either the tragedy of the character or the point of the design.
Aaron Dembski Bowden's Night Lords trilogy, Soul Hunter, Blood Reaver,
Voidstalker, published between 2010 and 2012, is the canonical foundation through which the contemporary reframe became possible. Dembski-Bowden didn't write a Chaos Raider story. He wrote a story about a legion that retained internal coherence, operational purpose, and specific institutional logic well beyond what the official classification accounted for. That authorial work is the textual evidence base through which the argument being constructed here found its canonical grounding. In 005.M31, Horus Lupercal began the civil war that would be called the Horus Heresy. The standard model for traitor Primarchs involves supernatural intervention. Horus, the wound at Davin, the warp entity that reshaped his consciousness through it. Lorgar, the ruinous powers filling the faith-shaped void the Emperor had carved out of him at Monarchia. Fulgrim, a Slaneshi demon possessing his body at the precise moment of his greatest pride. Magnus, Tzeentch's manipulation of his desperate loyalty. Angron, the butcher's nails, implanted by his former masters, driving his neurology toward violence independently of anything he chose. Curze had none of this. The Night Lords, as a legion, canonically resist chaos corruption, confirmed across multiple sources, consistent with the post-heresy gene seed assessment that found their genetic material unexpectedly pure after 10,000 years operating inside the Eye of Terror. His turn to the traitor faction wasn't a supernatural event. It was an assessment. The assessment ran as follows. Curze had spent decades conducting compliance-era correction against institutional failures the Crusade couldn't officially acknowledge. He had warned his brother Primarchs, through the precognitive visions he carried from birth, that the Crusade's internal corruption wasn't being corrected at the scale the problem required. He had been ignored, dismissed, confined to quarters at Cheraut when his methodology became too legible to the wrong audience. He had watched Nostromo collapse back into criminal entropy within decades of his departure. The control case, the cleanest evidence available, confirming that his function required continuous presence to maintain its effect. He had watched the Crusade generate the same structural failures at galactic scale without the corrective mechanism that might have addressed them. When the heresy came, it wasn't a surprise. He had been seeing fragments of it in his visions for 30 years.
What it represented institutionally was the confirmation of the operational failure he had been unable to get the Imperium to hear. The institution had collapsed at precisely the coherence problem he had been built to address. He didn't join the traitors from loyalty to Horus. The Forge World text is direct. The Night Haunter would prove ill-suited to the task he was assigned. Horus needed the Nostromo sector's worlds for the rebellion's logistics. Curze spent the deployment conducting his own private war against the criminal syndicates that had filled the power vacuum his earlier departure created. A campaign that actively consumed the resources the War Master needed rather than producing them. When Horus required operational assets, Curze gave him an ideological demonstration about what happens when the enforcement mechanism is absent long enough. The Thramas Crusade, fought from 007 to 009 M31, illustrates what remained of Curze's operational function within the traitor hierarchy. Horus needed the Dark Angels pinned in the eastern fringe, unable to reinforce the siege of Terra, unable to bring Lion L. Johnson's forces to the throne world in time to matter. Curze executed that mission. The Night Lords fought for nearly 3 years across the Aegis subsector against 70,000 Dark Angels and a matching naval fleet. The cost was catastrophic. 60,000 Night Lords killed, 12 capital ships destroyed including 1/4 of the Legion's entire fleet,
the Legio Ulricon annihilated, First Captain Sevatar captured. Tactically, a loyalist victory. Strategically, the War Master's objective was achieved. The Dark Angels arrived at Terra too late to affect the siege's outcome. 60,000 dead, a quarter of the fleet. The 8th Legion's permanent degradation as a unified operational force in exchange for one strategic objective.
Curze paid that price to execute a mission assigned by an employer he didn't particularly respect, in service of a rebellion he was participating in for reasons that had nothing to do with the rebellion's stated goals. That isn't the behavior of a Primarch who had abandoned institutional purpose. That is an asset completing an assigned function under extreme operational constraint. His final stated position is in the canonical record. The full statement, confirmed across multiple sources. Your presence does not surprise me, assassin. I have known of you ever since your craft entered the eastern fringes. Why did I not have you killed? Because your mission and the act you are about to commit proves the truth of all I have ever said or done. I merely punished those who had wronged, just as your false emperor now seeks to punish me. Death is nothing compared to vindication. The institutional logic in that sentence is precise. The emperor punishes transgression. That is the foundational, operational claim of the Great Crusade. Curze punished transgression. The emperor is now punishing Curze. Therefore, the emperor's action confirms the principle they both served. The punishment validates the punisher's premise. Vindication outweighs survival because vindication is the proof, and proof was always the point. Zagwalsa lies along the Tithe Road in the Thramas sector's eastern fringe, the route that once connected those systems to the destroyed world of Nostromo. Curze made it his stronghold in the decades following the heresy's end. The Lexicanum places his death there at approximately 036.M31, roughly 2 decades after the siege of Terra's conclusion, not during the heresy itself as some accounts have suggested. Those 2 decades matter. He spent them watching the post-heresy Imperium take institutional shape, the Second Founding, the Codex Astartes, the new administrative architecture Robute Guilliman built from the rubble of the Civil War, and assessing whether what was being constructed addressed the problem he had been deployed against. His continued presence on Zagwalsa suggests his assessment of the new institution wasn't favorable. Machene was a Calidus assassin of the Officio Assassinorum. She is the only mortal in the canonical record to have killed a Primarch in single combat. By the time she reached Zagwalsa, Curze had been tracking her craft since it entered the eastern fringe. He had time to kill her. He had time to have her killed by his legion before she disembarked. He chose neither. On the night Machene arrived, Curze had spent his hours constructing an effigy of the emperor from the mutilated bodies of slaves. He built it on his throne. He arranged it with care. He sat in the dark before it and conducted a conversation. The emperor's voice and the night haunter's voice both emerging from the same throat, the father and the son running through the argument one final time, until he heard her moving through the shadows toward him. When she arrived, he spoke first. He told her he had known she was coming from the moment her ship entered the fringe. He told her the answer to the question she had not asked, why he had not had her killed. And the answer was that her presence proved everything. His career had been premised on the claim that institutional transgression produces consequence, that punishment isn't cruelty, but correctness applied to specific, verified facts about specific, verified violations. The Emperor was now applying that principle to him. The Emperor, by sending Machene, was validating the premise on which everything Curze had done was built.
Death is nothing compared to Vindication. He sat. She killed him. The reading of this as a voluntary retirement of the coherence mechanism, Curze choosing to decommission himself on terms that delivered a final institutional argument with maximum clarity, having concluded that the post-heresy Imperium was no longer the institution his deployment had been designed to correct, is an interpretive argument rather than a statement in any primary text. The canon establishes the foreknowledge, the deliberate non-resistance, and the explicit framing of the death as vindication. The argument about what that combination means operationally is the analyst's construction from those elements. The audience should weigh it as such. What isn't in dispute? The last judge issued a judgment about his own execution, found it institutionally correct, and let it proceed without resistance. M'Shen survived the kill. Soul Hunter records what happened to her approximately 10,000 years later. The Night Lord Talos Valcorin found her. The hunt that had waited that long concluded. The Night Lord's institutional memory is patient. After Tsagwalsa, the Legion fragmented. The Forge World text describes it directly. Without Curze, the Night Lords lost the organizing principle that had maintained their coherence and broke into competing warbands. They retreated into the Eye of Terror and the Imperial frontier. The official post-heresy record classifies what followed as random terror raids, chaos-affiliated pirates with no coherent operational agenda beyond survival and predation, a standard entry in the Traitor Legion threat taxonomy. Dembski-Bowden's trilogy is the primary canonical source for what the Night Lords actually did. The warband of Talos Valcorin in Soul Hunter, Blood Reaver, and Void Stalker moves with specific intelligence, targeted objectives, and internal philosophical coherence that the random raider classification does not account for. They aren't random. They carry Curze's last address as operational doctrine. Whether the targets they select and the operations they run constitute a continued expression of the 8th Legion's original institutional function, whether these Night Lords are, in some degraded and unauthorized form, still performing work related to what they were built to do, is the interpretation the trilogy makes available without explicitly confirming. The claim that the post-heresy Imperium deliberately chose not to exterminate the Night Lords because their continued operational presence served a deterrence function the official institution couldn't acknowledge needing, is reconstruction from circumstantial evidence, not a stated policy in any primary source. What is documentable? The Night Lords maintained coherent Legion identity across 10,000 years of Eye of Terror operations. Their gene seed, assessed in the post-heresy period, was found unexpectedly pure. The Battle of Tsagwalsa brought Imperial forces to their stronghold in a major offensive, and the Night Lords survived it. These are facts. The institutional interpretation of why the Imperium's response took the shape it did, and whether tolerance was ever deliberate rather than simply failed, is analysis built on those facts. Before his death, Curze addressed his legion. The address is canonical, confirmed in Dembski-Bowden's Night Lord's work. My sons, the galaxy is burning. We all bear witness to a final truth. Our way isn't the way of the Imperium. You have never stood in the Emperor's light, never worn the Imperial eagle, and you never will. You shall stand in midnight clad, your claws forever red with the lifeblood of my father's failed empire, warring through the centuries as the talons of a murdered god. Rise, my sons, and take your wrath across the stars in my name, in my memory. Rise, my Night Lords. Read that as an operational brief rather than a farewell. Duration: centuries. Theater: the ruins of the failed empire. Mission: their wrath, across the stars, in his name, in his memory. A man who spent the night before his accepted death constructing an effigy of the emperor to rehearse his argument with, and his final hours issuing a mission order intended to outlast him by millennia. That isn't dispersal, that is deployment. Games Workshop's 2024 and 2025 releases have made canonical what was implicit in the lore for decades. The contemporary Imperium is in institutional crisis at a depth the post-heresy architecture wasn't designed to handle. The Golden Throne's condition is a documented crisis. The High Lords operate with the factional dysfunction and documented corruption of any institution that has spent 10,000 years accumulating the interests of those who benefit from its continuation.
The Mechanicus holds entire categories of technically critical knowledge through classified archive structures that no oversight mechanism the Imperium officially recognizes can access. The Inquisition, designed specifically to fill the enforcement gap the Crusade's expansion phase generated, has spent 10,000 years accumulating philosophical fragmentation, personal fiefdoms, and jurisdictional disputes that the factional corruption it was designed to address has had 10,000 years to learn to navigate. The problem Curze was built to solve is structurally larger now than it was when he was deployed against it. Roboute Guilliman returned from stasis in the era Indomitus and found an institution that had spent 10,000 years generating precisely the corruption the 8th Legion had been calibrated against. He amended the Edict of Restraint and deployed the Custodes across the galaxy in unprecedented numbers. The Emperor's Praetorians operating in a new capacity, without the operational doctrine their new role requires, confronting an institutional problem their original mandate was never designed to address. He had the Inquisition, formally mandated as the general-purpose enforcement apparatus the Crusade lacked. Neither instrument has proven sufficient for the scale of the problem the era of ruin has made visible. Wolf Lord Rowe's question, whether Curze is the Primarch the Emperor needs, points towards something the canonical record makes structural. The contemporary Imperium is facing the same coherence problem the 8th Legion was originally deployed to address, at a magnitude that has had 10,000 years of compound growth, without any instrument possessing the specific operational parameters Curze's Legion embodied. The current Custodes deployment isn't that instrument.
The current Inquisition isn't that instrument. Guilliman himself isn't that instrument. He is a builder and administrator. The Imperium needs him to maintain the architecture. What he can't provide, and what the current institutional structure can't produce, is the known consequence for institutional transgression in compliance theaters that operates below the threshold of formal political acknowledgement and above the threshold of administrative workaround. Return to the Cheraut prison wall. The compliance campaign there required 3 legions, 3 Primarchs, and produced enough institutional strain that one Primarch put another in the Medicae ward, and the Imperium's response was silence. No trial, no public censure, no formal record. The Forge World text notes explicitly that the incident was long concealed from historians in the archives of the Imperial Palace. The concealment is diagnostic. An institution that seals the record of a Primarch attacking his brother, that chooses the appearance of Crusade unity over the institutional transparency its own founding ideology demands, is already operating through the hidden choices Curze carved into the wall. It's already choosing what to undertake in the dark while none can see. Curze knew this. He had been watching it since Nostromo.
He carved that sentence because he understood that the institution he served was constitutively dependent on precisely the class of hidden action it officially prohibited, and that the only mechanism capable of making that dependency legible, of attaching a consequence to it, was the one currently being confined for having made it too visible to ignore. The Emperor built the 8th Legion from the prison sinks beneath Terra because that origin produced warriors calibrated for darkness, born in it, shaped by it, capable of operating in it without the institutional hesitation that surface-level daylight civilization produces in those who have known no other world. He gave their Primarch pre-built knowledge of imperial law and the title, the Last Judge. He deployed them against the documented category of institutional failure that no other Crusade-era mechanism was architected to address. The Forge world confirms the deployment logic. The Emperor sent the 8th Legion, specifically, when what was needed was retribution against those who harbored treachery within the Imperium's interior. At Nostramo, when the Emperor arrived with 4 Primarchs and the light of his fleet blinding a population adapted to eternal darkness, Curze said, "That isn't my name, Father. I am Night Haunter." He knew what the assignment was before it was offered. The Emperor heard this and took him anyway. That exchange is in the canonical record. Both men understood what was being agreed to. The post-heresy High Lords required the gene line failure narrative because the alternative was an acknowledgement the moral reconstruction couldn't survive, that the Crusade's coherence had depended, in part, on a deliberately deployed terror apparatus that the imperial truth's stated values couldn't accommodate. The receipt had to be buried. Curze was classified as a pathological accident rather than a specific design. The official history was written accordingly. And then the Night Lord's gene seed was assessed, after 10,000 years in the Eye of Terror, under conditions that had corrupted stronger legions with better institutional support, and it came back clean. The 8th Legion, without supply chains or reinforcement, or the Primarch who calibrated them, had maintained operational coherence and genetic integrity across a duration that isn't consistent with a malfunction in the original design. A true gene line failure does not produce 10,000 years of clean gene seed under maximum adverse conditions. A purpose-built instrument, operating far beyond its original operational parameters without support, in conditions of extreme difficulty and isolation, might. The cover story has held for 30,000 years. The era of ruin is generating the conditions under which it will be forced to crack. On the day the Imperium is forced to acknowledge what it requires, not Curze specifically, but the function Curze embodied, the High Lords will face a question they have been avoiding since the Second Founding. First to themselves, then to the Imperial citizenry,
and finally to the 8th Legion in the Eye of Terror. Patient, intact, gene seed clean, waiting for a call that hasn't yet come. The question isn't which Primarch should return. The question is, which corruption is so deeply embedded in the contemporary Imperium's institutional structure, so protected by the officials who benefit from it, so load-bearing in the dysfunction the High Lords have built their authority around, so invisible to any enforcement mechanism the post-heresy Imperium can officially deploy, that only an instrument with Curze's specific operational parameters could reach it. Curze knew the answer before he died. He carved the premise of it into the wall on Cheraut, in the one archive no High Lord could instruct to be sealed. The Imperium has been refusing to read it ever since. Subscribe for more.